Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you ask your questions on faith and life, and I do my best to give a biblical perspective. Speaking of which, if you've got questions, feel free to jump over to slido.com, use the hashtag ALC23. We'd love to hear from you. Well, let's jump into today's question. If God is holy and trustworthy, why does he lie? In Jeremiah 20 verse 7, it says that he lied to Jeremiah. So why do people worship a God who's dishonest? Let's bring up Isaiah 20 verse 7 if you're not familiar with it. Here we go. Lord, you misled me and I allowed myself to be misled. And some versions will have, Lord, you deceived me and I allowed myself to be deceived. You are stronger than I am and you overpowered me. Now I'm mocked every day. Everyone laughs at me. Yeah, there's so much. Where do I go? I guess fundamentally the question is, did God lie? Because you're right, if God lies, then why would we worship a God who's dishonest? This passage, at superficial reading, you're right, appears to go directly to the heart of a holy and trustworthy God. And so this passage, and there are others like it too. I can think of several passages like this that you could have chosen as well, if your purpose was to try and discredit God. And I'm not saying if this is your question that was your purpose, so please hear me on that. But I'm saying if somebody was, I could think of several passages in the Old Testament, several in the New, that would appear to say something similar. So what do we do with this? Well, two things, I guess. First off, does this verse actually, and the other verses like it, paint a picture of a deceitful God? And I would want to suggest that, properly understood, the answer is no. You see, in this verse, if you read it, Jeremiah is saying that God deceived him, and then he goes on and lists how, as a consequence of his declaring God's plans, he's mocked and he's abused. And so the question is, does the context actually support the statement that God's deceived him? And I don't think it does. I think if you read the entirety of Jeremiah, and nowhere do you find this sense that God deceived him. In fact, if you go back to the beginning of Jeremiah and God's call on his life, let me bring up some scriptures here. I should really learn how to set up my computer to show these scriptures online. Jeremiah, this is God's call to Jeremiah in chapter 1, verse 8. He says, don't be afraid of people because I have called you. That's essentially what he says. I'm paraphrasing because I can't bring it up, but basically in verse 8, when God calls him, he says, don't be afraid of people because of their opposition to me. And then in verses, I want to get this right. Towards the end of that, this is all to do with God's call on his life. Let me bring it up here. Let me read it out, verses 18 to 19. Today I've made you strong like a fortified city that cannot be captured, like an iron pillar or a bronze wall. You will stand against the whole land, the kings, officials, priests, and people of Judah. They will fight you, but they will fail. Why? Because I am with you and I will take care of you. Now, I read those up because right up front, when God calls Jeremiah, he tells people how people are going to respond to him and his message, and not to be discouraged. So I don't think you can make the case to say that God deceived or misled Jeremiah. I think when you come to this passage in Jeremiah 20, it suggests, if you read the entirety of Jeremiah, and particularly the passages that I just read out, and the verses about his call, where God's up front about the nature of the call and the opposition it's going to bring, it begs the question, is something else going on when in verse 7 of chapter 20? And I would want to say the answer is yes. The word for misled, or as some translations put it, deceived, is used differently in the Old Testament. So, for example, in Judges, when the Philistines are trying to get Samson's wife Delilah to find out what his strength is, what the secret of his strength is, in chapter 14, let me bring up verse 5. We read, they said to Samson's wife, entice, some versions put persuade your husband to explain the riddle for us, for we will burn down your father's house with you in it. And that word entice or persuade is the same word that we read in Jeremiah that says misled or deceived. Again, in Deuteronomy chapter 11, where God is talking about the blessings of obedience, in verse 16 we read, again, let me just make sure I get it perfect. In verse 16, it says, but be careful, don't let your hearts be deceived, or some versions have persuaded, so that you turn away from the Lord and serve and worship other gods. Proverbs 25 verse 15 says, patience can persuade a prince and soft speech can break bones. So that word in Jeremiah 27 that in this context was translated misled, or some versions have persuade, deceive, can be translated in a variety of different ways, which begs the question, how do you know which way to translate it? Because it can mean deceived, but or misled. It can mean persuade. It can mean enticed. It can also be used to translate the word inspire. So how do you know how to translate it? And I'd want to suggest that the answer is always the context. You've got to look at the context to see how this word should be translated. And I think that if you go back, as I say, to Jeremiah chapter 1 and his call, God's up front. He's not deceiving him. He's saying, my call on your life is going to bring conflict. People are going to mock you. People are going to ridicule you. And so it suggests right up front that we should, maybe there's a better way of translating that word in Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 7. And in fact, if you go to the NRV, which is the new revised version, it says, Lord, you have enticed me and I was enticed. You've overpowered me and you have prevailed. The New King James Version says, Lord, you induced me and I was persuaded. You're stronger and I prevailed. In other words, the holiness of God, the plans and purposes of God for Jeremiah's life persuaded him to, and God's holiness persuaded him to accept the call. And just as God said it would, it brought conflict, it brought hardship, it brought opposition into his life. But God never deceived him. So it doesn't mean, in response to your question, that God lies. It just reflects the humanness of Jeremiah and his cry to God. In fact, that's something that I think we need to focus on in passages like this. It reminds us that in times when we're wrestling with our faith, when we're wrestling with the sovereignty of God, the goodness of God, the holiness of God, of why doesn't God do something when he could? Why does God allow something to happen when he could sovereignly step in? That it's okay in those times to express our humanity, our struggle to understand, our disappointments, our frustrations, our questions, because I think that's exactly what Jeremiah's doing in chapter 20 and in other passages where we read something similar. I think of in Kings, for example. So God's not lying. God's not being dishonest. What it reflects is the tension between the holiness and the sovereignty of God and our struggles to make sense of that at times in our life. So I hope that answers your question. Don't read scripture looking for reasons not to believe God, not to trust God. Perhaps instead start with this idea: if God is who he says he is, why would I not trust him? And start from that perspective. Start from a more positive perspective. But yeah, that's how I look at this passage. Love to hear your thoughts on it. Highlights why looking at more than one translation is always a good thing. But hey, that's it for now. I'd love to hear from you. But until next time, God bless.